Hello student, I am Professor Devashish Bose, Head, Department of Criminology and Forensic Science, Dr. Hari Singh Gaur Vishwavidyalaya, Sagar, Madhya Pradesh. Today I am going to present a lecture of BA first semester on the unit Introduction to Criminology, and the topic will be Etiology of Crime Part 2, Psychological Theories of Crime, which has been prepared by Dr. Deepak Gupta, a PhD in Criminology and a guest faculty at Department of Criminology and Forensic Science, Dr. Hari Singh Gaur Vishwavidyalaya, Sagar. So my dear student, let's start our discussion while taking a look at what we are going to learn today in Etiology of Crime Part 2, that is Psychological Theories of Crime. As usual, our Module 1 will be Introduction, Module 2 will be Criminal Thinking Patterns, Module 3 will be Personality Defects, Module 4 Psychoanalytical Explanations, Module 5 will be our conclusion. So, a psychological explanation of crime can refer to a variety of approach and concepts, but as Netzel notes, these theories all share the basic belief that crime is the result of some personal attribute uniquely possessed or possessed to a special degree by the potential criminal. In some variants of this approach, the cause is an extreme one, such as a mental illness or a personality disorder. Some of the psychological approach even rely on hereditary determinants. Psychologists have a considerable variety of possibilities to account for individual difference, such as defective consciences, emotional immaturity, inadequate childhood socialization, maternal deprivation, poor moral development, etc., etc. They study how aggression is learned, which situation promotes violent or delinquent reaction, how crime is related to personality factors, and the association between mental disorder and criminality. Psychological theory states that people commit crime because of personality imbalance developed during the early childhood. However, many of these theories do you subscribe to? How many do you see affect your community or society? According to psychological theories, crime results from individual mental or emotional disturbances, inability to empathize with others, inability to legally satisfy their basic needs, or oppressive circumstances of life. To combat crime, psychological positivists would isolate, sterilize, or execute offenders not amenable to treatment. For treatable offenders, psychotherapy or psychoanalysis may prove effective. Other policy implications are to help people satisfy their basic needs legally, to eliminate sources of oppression, and to provide legal ways of coping with oppressions. Of several psychological explanations, the following are important ones. They are criminal thinking pattern, personality defects, psychoanalytical explanations. Samuel Yuchelson and Stanton E. Samnow, they are the psychiatrists who propose that criminals possess a different way of thinking. That is, criminals operate out of a unique set of cognitive patterns that, through internally logical and consistent in erogenous according to responsible thinking. The consistent lawbreaker sees himself and the world differently from the way the rest of us see them. Yuchelson and Samnow, psychiatrists at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., reject environmental explanation of criminality, such as a broken home or unemployment. They claim criminals are criminals. People become criminal as a result of a series of choices they start making at an early age. It is these patterns that result in criminality. Crime is like alcoholism. Once a criminal, always a criminal. This was their point of view. They think like it. The psychiatrist shows the criminals they studied as very much in control of their action rather than being sick. It means they are not sick. It's not a disease. They know, the criminals know what they are doing. It's not a disease. No one is infecting them. It's they, by their own choice, by their own will, by knowing the consequences, they are doing this. These criminals were portrayed as master manipulators who try to assign the blame for their own behavior to others. So they are masters. They say that they are above normal. For Yuchelson and Samsnow, criminals simply don't play the game the way the rest of us do. They are different. They play it different. They think they are more clever, rather, we can say. The criminals are more clever. They are such inveterate liars that they can no longer separate facts from fiction. You have to believe them. They use words to control and manipulate, not to represent reality. Limitation of theory. The psychiatrists based their conclusion on intensive interviews with a relatively small number of offenders, most of whom were incarcerated hardcore criminals or men who were hospitalized after having been acquitted of major crimes by reason of insanity. They carefully portrayed one type of criminal, but whether their analysis accurately represents the majority of lawbreakers is doubtful. The criminal thinking pattern theory does not explain how these choices are made in the beginning. All criminals may not have a tendency to repeat or continue the same pattern of behavior. Many lay persons explain the cause of crime as some form of personality defect in the offender. Taken to this extreme degree, the explanation forms the basis for theories that attributes a basic antisocial nature of the criminal. This conception of psychopath has a long history. Generally, it refers to persons who have frequent and repetitive criminal activity. More recently, the focus has been on the underlying unsocialized character, the lack of consensus that brings such persons into repeated conflict with society. They are unable to learn from experiences or feel guilt. They lack loyalty to individuals, groups, or even to the society's value. A Netzel observes, they are grossly selfish, callous, and irresponsible. They tend to blame others or to offer plausible rationalization for their behavior. All this combines to give them an arrogance that can lead to their downfall and capture. According to Goldman, about 80% of psychopaths are men. The person characterized by a personality disorder or psychopathic personality is relatively easy to identify but very difficult to rehabilitate. Fortunately, psychopaths account for a very small percentage of law violators. However, they commit a disproportionately large percentage of violent crimes, and their acts are such that they attract massive publicity. For years, researchers have sought some physical or psychological characteristics that distinguish psychopath personalities from others. A study showed that psychopaths seems to have an unusual and characteristic pattern of brain organization in that the neurological center that controls language demonstrates signs of irregular development. By Sigmund Freud, the founder of Psychoanalysis, suggested that criminality may result from either an overactive conscience or too weak conscience. In treating his patient, Freud noticed that those who were suffering from unbearable guilt of committed crimes in order to be apprehended and punished. Once they had been punished, their feelings of guilt were relieved. that is a way of punishing themselves. So segment Freud's psychoanalysis, the id, ego and superego. The varying components of the personality. In the year 1920, when he was nearly 65 years old, Freud proposed a new conception of the personality, one that contained three systems: the id, the ego and the superego. These systems do not exist physically. They are only concepts or way of looking at a personality. The id is the only part of the personality that is present at the time of birth. The id. It is inherited, primitive, inaccessible and completely unconscious because it comes from the birth. The id contains two kinds of instinct. The life instinct, which are sexual instinct and biological urges such as hunger, thirst. It is obvious. And the death instinct, which accounts for our aggressive and destructive impulses. Clear? I think it is clear, my dear student, what is the id? The id operates according to the pleasure principle, that is, to seek pleasure, avoid pain and gain immediate gratification of its wishes. The id is the source of the libido, the psychic energy that fuels the entire personality. Yet, the id cannot act on its own. It can wish, image, fantasize, demand. The ego is the logical, rational, realistic part of the personality. The ego evolves from the id and draws its energy from id. Yet, the id cannot act on its own. It can wish, image, fantasize, demand. The ego is the logical, rational, realistic part of the personality. The ego evolves from the id and draws its energy from id. One of the ego's function is to satisfy the id's urges. Id wants it and ego satisfied. So, it's the ego comes from the id. But the ego, which is mostly conscious, acts according to the reality principle. Id wants it, okay? But ego has to work rationally. Clear? It must consider the constraint of the real world in determining the appropriate time, place and object for gratification of the id's wishes. The art of the possibility is its guide and sometimes compromises must be made. For example, a chicken sandwich instead of a fish curry. When the child is the age of 5 or 6, the superego, the moral component of the personality is formed. The superego has again two parts. The conscience consists of all the behaviors for which we have been punished and about which we feel guilty. The ego ideals contains the behavior for which we have been praised and rewarded and about which we feel pride and satisfaction. At first, the superego reflects only the parent's expectation of what is good and right, but it expands over the time to incorporate teachings from the broader social world. In this quest for moral perfection, the superego sets moral guidelines that define and limit the flexibility of ego. The psychoanalytical theory of criminality attributes delinquents and criminal behaviors to a conscience so overbearing that it arouses feeling of guilt, so weak that it cannot control the individual's impulse and to need for immediate gratification. For example, in Richard's case, Richard was 6 when he committed his first delinquent act. What he did? He stole a comic from a corner drugstore, a simple comic book. 3 months before the incidents, his father, an alcoholic, had died in an automobile accident. After this sad and tragic incident in his life, his mother became unable to take care of the family and have abandoned this particular child. For the next 10 years, the state welfare agency moved Richard in and out of the home. During this time, his activity pursued a life of crime, breaking into houses during daylight and stealing cars by the night. By the age of 20, while serving a 10 years prison sentence for armed robbery, he voluntarily entered into psychoanalysis. After 2 years, Richard's analyst suggested 3 reasons for his criminality. It's a psychoanalysis, what I am telling. Being caught and punished for stealing made him feel less guilty about hating his father and mother for abandoning him. Stealing did not violate his moral and ethical principle. Stealing resulted in immediate gratification and pleasure, both which Richard had great difficulty resisting. So, my dear student, at this point, can you define me what was Richard's id, ego and superego? I think you can write down this answer. Richard's psychoanalyst suggests that Richard's anger over his father's death and subsequently his mother's abandoning him created unconscious feeling of guilt, which he sought to be relieved by committing a crime and been punished for it. So, I hope this is clear, the Richard's case. The psychoanalyst also offered an alternative explanation for Richard's persistent criminal activity. His conscience was perhaps not too strong, but too weak. The conscience or superego was so weak or defective or could not have grown that the ego, which acts as a moderator between the superego and the id, was unable to control the impulses of id, the part of the personality that contains powerful urges and drives for gratification and satisfaction. Repeat, for gratification and satisfaction, because the superego is essential and internalized personal image developed when the child assumes the parent's attitude and moral values. It follows that the absence of such an image may lead to an unrestrained id and thus to delinquency. Psychoanalytical theory suggests yet another explanation of Richard's behavior: an unstable need for immediate reward and gratification. A defect in the character formation of delinquents derives them to satisfy their desire at once, regardless of the consequences. This urge, which psychoanalyst attributes to the id, is so strong that relationships with people are important only as long as they help to satisfy their need. Most analysts view delinquents as children unable to give up their desire for instant pleasure. Sigmund Freud's influential theory about the development of personality provides a different explanation for criminal acts. Freud hypothesizes that the 3 sets of forces, the selfish, irrational ones, the rational forces and the moralistic ones, they are always struggling for control of behavior. He believed that the criminal suffers from a compulsive need for punishment to alleviate the guilt feeling. Other psychoanalysts, especially Franz Alexander, emphasize the inability to postpone immediate gratification in the criminal who has never came to internalize the reality principle. One of the reasons that psychoanalytical theory has had such an influence in the comprehensive as a description of the nature and process of human personality. In spite of criticism, 3 basic principles still appeals to the psychologists who study criminality are: the actions and behavior of an adult are understood in terms of childhood development. behavior and unconscious motives and intervened, and the interaction must be unraveled if we are to understand criminality. Criminality is essentially a representation of psychological conflict. Limitations to psychoanalytical theories. Though it is a thorough explanation, it is very difficult to test or validate the theory through empirical work. The actual patterns of criminal conduct usually differs generally from Freud's explanation. Lawbreakers go to extreme top avoid detection. These facts make his hypothesis of that criminal suffers from a compulsive need to be punished and be cleansed from their guilt feeling. A variety of psychological explanations have been advanced. Samuel Yuchelson and Santon E. Samnow, psychiatrists, propose that criminals possess a different way of thinking. One is which they manipulate matters for their behavior is shifted to other. Freud believed that the criminals suffer from a compulsive need for punishment, and so crime are committed to permit the offender to be cleansed of the guilt. This brief section summarizes the central feature of psychological theory of crime causation. Each of these points can be found elsewhere in this chapter, where we have discussed it in more detail. This cursory overview, however, is intended to provide more than a summary. It means to be guide to the rest of this whole chapter of the psychological theories of the crime causation and certain fundamental assumption. The individual is the primary unit of analysis. Personality is the major motivational element within individual because it is the seat of drive and the source of motives. Crimes result from abnormal, dysfunctional or inappropriate mental process within the personality. Criminal behavior, while condemned by the social group, may be purposeful for the individual insofar as it addresses certain felt need. Behavior can be judged inappropriate only when measured against external criteria purporting to establish normality. Normality is generally defined by social consensus, that is, what the majority of people in the social group agree is real, appropriate or typical. Defective of abnormal mental process may have a variety of causes, including a diseased mind, inappropriate learning or improper conditioning, the emulsion of inappropriate role models, adjustment to inner conflict. My dear student, with all these information, here we come to the end of today's important lecture. Do keep in mind what we have discussed today. This is Professor Devashish Bose signing off for now. If you want to learn more and enhance your knowledge, you may visit our website for MCQs, quizzes, LOR at www.cec.nic.in. Till then, thank you and goodbye.